With the Cincinnati music scene coming back strong now after a couple of slow years, it's a good time to look back at the history of music in Cincinnati, specifically some of the iconic venues here in our area. Some you may have heard of, some might be brand new to you. They are in this new book by Stephen Rosen. It's called Lost Cincinnati Concert Venues of the 50s and 60s. Stephen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Betsy, for the invitation. Very pleased to be here.
So before we start talking about the book and some of those concert venues in the past, let's talk about your idea for this book. Where did the idea for this book come from?
I love the concert venues that are in the book that I was lucky enough to go to. Very fond memories of them, particularly Ludlow Garage and the Black Dome. They're gone, and I wanted to remember what I thought was their important contributions to the city's cultural scene at that time, but also revisit the days when many acts who now might be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or to some extent are still touring and charging $100 or so for a concert. We're just playing small clubs because that's what the music scene was, or even playing the gardens, and indeed were big shows and now are legendary, perhaps because they are no longer in existence. The Beatles, of course, is an example of that. So I was driven by my own interest, but also just a kind of a healthy interest in just places that I think were important to the city's day-to-day life and its entertainment and to its urbanism. And to me, music clubs like sports teams, like downtown movie theaters, like old shopping centers that often they're no longer around or not around in a way that you would know, and they deserve to be remembered.
The clubs really range from blues, jazz, soul, what we would call soul now, to rock and roll, country, rockabilly, even back in the 50s. Why do you think there was such a diverse range of music here in Greater Cincinnati?
Well, I think part of it is if you start at the 50s, which is by then it's after World War II, people were returning back to normal. They had time for entertainment. They had time to look forward to going out on the weekend. They had maybe some extra money to spend. They were in a good mood. And also, particularly starting in the 50s, there was a lot of different kinds of music emerging at the same time and finding audiences, particularly finding a young audience, the boomers, that were starting to come of age both in the late 50s and then certainly in the 60s. And music really became important to them, probably driven by top 40 radio, driven by who they could see on the Ed Sullivan Show, rock and roll, and particularly, you mentioned blues, rhythm and blues, Motown, country, and also in the 50s, jazz was a very popular music with radio stations devoted to it. Lots of acts touring and looking for places where they could play. So it was just this great meeting point. And that sort of drove things into the 60s. And then in the late 60s, you had another one of these huge changes where rock that was seen as a fun teenage music all of a sudden attracted people who took it as seriously as perhaps their parents might take classical or jazz as the Beatles came around. is a best example. But so there was just so much going on. I think Cincinnati was in a good place to capitalize on that because it did have the radio stations that played quite a variety of music. The newspapers were very important. Cincinnati Post, which was the afternoon paper, had a entertainment editor and writer named Dale Stevens, who probably did, I think, 4 or 5 stories a day covering what would happen. I have no idea how he was able to sleep, or if he did sleep, but he was making everything exciting. And then once you hit the mid 60s, the Inquirer started a teenager section and also it increased its coverage of what youth were doing, and had a writer editor named Jim Nippenberg, who was really at that time probably about the age of maybe just a little bit older of those who wanted to read what he was finding in local clubs and listening to new records. And you could see that he felt he was right in the presence of great change and wrote about things with great excitement. So that really changed a lot of things in the city and made it a very active concert city. Not that it didn't happen in other cities, but Cincinnati was one of the cities where it was happening.
And we do miss Nip, that's for sure. His columns were wonderful. The small jazz clubs, blues clubs, you talk about the West End. And the small clubs were almost like the corner bar. It was really part of the neighborhood. And then the interstate came through. And that was really the end. It seemed like it was the end of a very important part of Cincinnati music history.
Yes. And I agree with that. The interstate I-75 really helped cause the decline of the Cotton Club, which was a really thriving blues, jazz, big band venue. It actually caused the place to move to Walnut Hills in the 50s. And it was never quite the same thing. So that really sort of changed it changed the neighborhood. I know some people say it essentially cut up a neighborhood so that it no longer had that cohesion. And that's definitely a loss. I mean, what people think about interstates and their impact on cities is still a very controversial topic today.
Let's talk about some of the specific arenas and event spaces that you bring up. Crosley Field, you wouldn't necessarily think of it as a music venue, but of course it was. And you have an entire chapter, deservedly so, for the Beatles at Cincinnati Gardens, and then the famous one at Crosley Field that came out a day late. Tell me why you think that the Beatles' visit to Cincinnati was so important culturally. I mean, this was really at the height of their popularity.
That was their last tour, essentially, their last tour of America. Essentially, that tour had their last concerts. I know they did play on the roof of the Apple headquarters in order to have a short concert for a movie, but this was it. And it still attracted an audience because it was they're only 2 years into the British invasion of America. It still attracted an audience that was enthralled by the Beatles of 1964 and everything that they represented, the look, the sound, the humor, and came out so basically they could shriek through it. And also we're a very polite audience. maybe not if you think about were they deep listeners, they were just thrilled with everything. I mean, being there. At the same time that brought them out to see the Beatles were changing. In 1966, they had their album Revolver, which most people think marked a huge change in the quality of their music and the seriousness of their music. And they were giving up live performing in order to concentrate more on studios and to develop the artfulness of their music. So you had those two things coming together right in 1966. I mean, it's one of those moments when culture changes, particularly popular music, rock music change. And this was the tour that sort of caught that. And it was a tour that came to Cincinnati, which made Cincinnati one of the places where I guess the now famous last Beatles tour occurred. So that makes it significant. The fact that when the show was supposed to be, got rained out, but they were lucky enough to reschedule it, also puts a pretty interesting story behind what happened here, because so many of the people who went all of a sudden had to figure out, how am I going to see the Beatles the next day? I don't have arrangements to do that. And a lot, weren't of driving age, a lot were teenagers. So many people who went have stories about how they managed to get to the second day. Others have stories about how they weren't able to go or weren't planning to go or couldn't go, that all of a sudden had this opportunity thrown in their laps at the last minute. You're going to have a second chance to go see the Beatles. And they rushed for it. And of course, that not only was the second chance, but the last chance. So it's become, it's an important concert, but it's also, in Cincinnati, it's legendary because of how it actually managed to happen, given all the drawbacks.
Mm. Let's talk about Ludlow Garage. Ludlow Garage was one of these venues that I have heard all my life. I've heard about the Ludlow Garage, but I didn't realize that it had a very short lifespan. I mean, given the music scene in this area, it wasn't around for all that long, but what an impact that it had on the music scene that, we're still talking about it now. Why was Ludlow Garage so impactful?
Again, this is one of the times, I mean, in the 60s, especially the late 60s, everything was changing. Popular music, youth music especially. So some people might say it was out in front of all of the change. So the music that Ludlow Garage was featuring, was the kind of music that a very new radio station at the time, this was WEBN, and played album, I guess you'd call it album rock now, progressive rock, alternative rock. So that they were sort of the place that you went to see the bands that played the music that you heard on WEBN. It gave it quite a link to a radio station that also had a very important cultural presence in the city. A lot of those acts that came through were relatively new, or acts that you thought of as playing a club. And of course, some of them, I mean, you think of the Allman Brothers or Joe Walsh or the Kinks or Santana. If they're around today, they're playing huge outdoor venue shows. They're celebrating the 50th anniversary of a classic album, or they're celebrating being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They're, in a sense, they're sort of, I guess I'd almost use the term great elders sometimes the way you might talk about a political leader being an elder statesman or something. They're elder artists. So if you were lucky enough to see them, it's hard to forget just how impactful that was and also how great that was. The venue itself, because this was Jim Tarbell, I mean, who's still very active with us in terms of our cultural life. But he was really a sort of magnetic presence. He was sort of committed to Ludlow Garage being a safe place for kids, a place to sort of really get to know each other, to talk over new ideas, and also hear music. So people really enjoyed him. I remember one person that I talked to in my book, Terry Adams, who was in a group called NRBQ that played there, and I might add, it's still around, that just came to Cincinnati a couple of weeks ago, said he was more far out than any group that ever played there. So, I mean, he's just someone that if you went there, you just really remembered him. I mean, he was a presence. I mean, I guess you might call him like a Bill Graham of Cincinnati. The other thing is, yes, it didn't last long because the economy was such, the kind of groups that played there quickly were playing much bigger places. But in the year and a half or so that it existed, it was trying to have activities at least several nights a week, if not every night, frequently national acts that were coming through town, but also local acts. And for people who maybe had gone to a rock show or any kind of live music event, maybe once a month or twice a month, that was a big deal. And all of a sudden, it became the norm to sort of build your whole weekly life, certainly the nightlife, around going there several times, several times in a week, several times in a month. Mm-hmm. I use the baseball analogy, but you kept up for something else, but you kept up with who was at Ludlow Garage. If you could go, if your friends went, and what did you think? Maybe the way you might check the box scores for who won the baseball game last night, who's coming to town, or the basketball game, because this is back at the time that they still had a professional basketball team. So even though it closed relatively quickly, but you don't look back on it as thinking that it was just a short-lived place. It's like this towering achievement. You look at it, it's sort of like this cathedral of music that everyone sort of made a pilgrimage to several times a week.
Right. Yeah. And the pictures of Jim Tarbell with long hair and a beard, that's worth the price of admission right there. I mean, those were amazing pictures. So we have the Cincinnati Gardens, of course, gone. It had so many concerts there. But we have concerts at Paul Brown Stadium. We have concerts at Great American Ballpark. We have two smaller venues, one on each side of the river, that now are bringing in acts on a regular basis. Riverbend, of course, is still going strong, and that doesn't count some of the smaller arenas around our area that have concerts. Do you have a favorite concert venue right now that you like to go to, that you think that is a great place to see a concert?
Well, and this is probably my roots in really starting to go to concerts at Ludlow Garage, but I still am very fond of places that have some of that atmosphere. They maybe hold 500 to 1,000. You sort of stand or walk around the hall, and it just had, and some of the acts you see are maybe, I mean, very good, but maybe not superstars. So I like the Southgate House Revival. I think that has that. And I like the Woodward Theater in
Mhm.
over the Rhine, which also has some of that same ballroom style. I have to say, Memorial Hall, since it was renovated several years ago, and it's more of a sit down venue for acts, but it's just gorgeous. I
Oh,
mean,
it is. Yeah,
yeah,
it's beautiful.
it-
In some of my most favorite concerts, I've seen at Top Cats, I've seen at Bogart's.
oh
I
yeah,
saw Tony Bennett at Bogart's, for
oh
Pete's
my
sake.
gosh.
And then, of course, we just had the Who at TQL Stadium. So let's take you back now. We talked a lot about Ludlow Garage. Do you have a favorite from that era, whether it's still here or not, that you really thought was so important to the music scene 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Well, I would definitely say Ludlow Garage, and a place that preceded it, uh, just in the same year that it opened, 1969, called the Black Dome. I was only lucky enough to go to that about 3, 4 times, but it was really cool. And the music, I saw like Taj Mahal there, or Joe Walsh or John Mayall, and it was electrifying. Sort of a dark place, but everybody was really happy and really into music. I mean, you went there and if you talked during the show, you talked about the music, which is still to me such a cool way to see a show. I mean, I'm thankful for Cincinnati Gardens. I can't believe from doing this book just who came, uh, how they came, uh, and what kind of touring bills, or if they came solo. And my own memory of it at that time is the sound wasn't so great, but when you see who played, and you either read the reviews, or I was able to find people who went to a lot of shows that I did not, just how vivid the memories are of it. I mean, in some ways, I'm not sure, 50, 60 years on, if the sound quality matters as much as the fact that these people came. The book is only about the lost venues, those that aren't there anymore. But I have to say, I was able to go to Music Hall in the late 60s, early 70s, when they really started to have a lot of the rock acts, like the Who and Derek and the Dominoes, and the Kinks were another. And I mean, you have a beautiful place with beautiful sound, and just turned over to people who liked rock, and you were seeing the music in a setting that took it seriously. I mean, because this is where the hollowed classic music played so much. So that's one that I would say is a favorite. And favorites of places that I didn't go to, which mostly would be the sort of the clubs that served alcohol when I was a minor. But gosh, I would have loved to have gone to the Flamingo Club when Little Richard played there with a young guitarist, Jimi Hendrix, whom no one knew yet, didn't go by that name. That would have been cool. I would have loved to have seen John Coltrane at Babe Baker's. I would have liked to have been able to go to Cincinnati Gardens earlier in the 50s to see some of the great rock and roll reviews, just when people like Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley were just sort of coming up. So yeah, I mean, they all sound great.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. And
Yeah.
speaking of Cincinnati Gardens, I saw Bob Dylan there. I didn't know what
Oh,
to
you
expect,
did?
and it was an amazing concert. It's just when Time Out of Mind came out.
Oh yeah.
Amazing. It was an amazing concert. So, well, you will be able to read about all those artists and all those venues in Stephen Rosen's book, Lost Cincinnati Concert Venues of the 50s and 60s. What an amazing look back at not only the venues, but the music history that has come out of Cincinnati. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so very much, Betsy. I really enjoyed it. And I'm glad to hear of your concert memories too.
Thank you. It does bring back a lot of memories. Thanks,
Yeah.
Stephen.